Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to Video Chat 6. In this video, I'll be talking about chapters 1 and 2 in Metzger. First, let's talk a little bit about the book's prologue. Each of the sections has a short prologue that kind of gives you a lead up to the two chapters that are in that part. So whether you're reading chapter 1 or 2, please read the prologue too. Now, the prologue, one of the key things I want you to look for is what we call historiography. Historiography is basically the study of how different historians have interpreted past events. So in the prologue, Metzger tells us that two of the people who've written about the strike of 1959, Tom Geohagen and John Strohmeyer, both come at the strike from a different perspective. Geohagen, he says, is kind of a leftist, and he basically criticizes the union for not having gotten very much out of the strike. Metzger disagrees with that. Secondly, he looks at Strohmeyer's interpretation. And Strohmeyer says the union got all it wanted. The union was very powerful. But then he goes on to critique the union and say the union was too powerful, and it by winning everything from the company that they got, that led to the downfall of steel in the United States because it became too expensive to produce. While Metzger disagrees with that interpretation, as you're going to see in the book, he does engage both these arguments in the book. At least Metzger says Strohmeyer acknowledges that the union was a causal factor in history. And so to some degree, he at least appreciates Strohmeyer's interpretation for the fact that it recognizes how powerful the union was. Okay, so first let's look at chapter 1. Chapter 1 is called Getting to 1959, and it deals with the Metzger family and the United States before and after unionization. He gives a short section in there about the history of the CIO. Much of this will be familiar to you, especially having read Honey's book, but he places it in context. So the Steelworkers Union emerged in the late 1930s, gained a little bit of power after the war, and through a series of strikes in the late 40s and early 50s, the union gradually built up wages, benefits, and working conditions for steel workers. This is a very important chapter because he also tells a story of how that effort benefited his family. For example, he talks about his grandfather and his uncle who were physically maimed by working in the steel mills and got virtually nothing for it. And then he also talks about how the foreman, prior to the unions coming, the foreman had absolute power, and they often abused that power. So he sees the union as providing benefits in terms of safety for workers, in terms of taking some of the arbitrary and absolute power that bosses had and putting some of that power, not all of it, but some of it in the hands of workers. And then finally, I want you to pay attention to what happens to the steel workers' standard of living and the standard of living of Metzger's family growing up in the 1950s. What did this have? What impact did this have economically on his family? It's a very important part of the chapter and a very important part of his argument. What did it do to their standard of living? So I want you to address that in both your summaries, but also you folks who are reading chapter 1, I'd like you to maybe pull out some key examples of that and post that on the discussion board for our chapter 2 folks to be able to read. Okay? So, pay attention to the ways in which the union improved working conditions for workers. Now let's turn to chapter 2. All right, chapter 2 is called No Backward Steps. And in it, he describes managements, not just the steel industry, but in a lot of industries that had unionized after World War II. By 1959, those corporations were interested in pushing back. They wanted to take back some of those gains. And Metzger in chapter 2 talks about the strike itself, what caused it, what the issues were, and how it was resolved. Now, it was resolved basically in favor of the union. Okay, he also talks about some of the specific parts of the union contract that the company was trying to take away. One of these was Section 2B of the steelworkers contract. And 2B is a very important part of the contract because that's the part of the contract that doesn't allow management to just eliminate jobs just because. There are certain rules that management has to follow. Now, there's a key concept here that Metzger talks about in his book that I want you to pay attention to. And it's one that his father was involved in as a griever for the union. His father was a shop floor worker, but if somebody had a problem, if a worker had a problem, they went to Johnny Metzger, and Johnny Metzger had to know the contract. He had to know it backwards and forward. He had to know what the rules were. And he had to interpret those rules and argue with the company, hey, you can't violate this or that rule. Metzger calls this, at some points in his book, the workplace rule of law. And you can kind of think of the contract like a constitution for the workplace. It's a set of rules that both sides have to agree to and that both sides have to abide by. Each side tries to argue its own interpretation of various clauses in that contract, but it's basically the rule of law. And workers have a certain due process, and it's a very legalistic system. One of the things that leftist critics like Geohagen argue is that became too bureaucratic. Well, kind of pay attention to what Metzger says about that argument. Okay, in some ways, the rule of law binds both parties and prohibits arbitrary rule or rule from above. And this is a very important concept that I think Metzger helps us understand about the actual process that unions participate in. It's not getting rid of capitalism. It's not that the workers have all the power. It's that the bosses don't have total arbitrary power. There's a set of rules that both sides have to agree to. So pay attention to Section 2B and try to understand how and why this was so important to the union and why it was so hated by management. Okay, so in your summaries, Chapter 2, folks, you can deal with that. Okay, in contrast to Geohagen's criticism that unions were just, bureaucracies that bogged down in workplace rules, Metzger offers a counter-argument. And I'd like to draw your attention to a passage on page 39 in Metzger's book. And I want to read it to you because I think it really encapsulates part of his argument that this was actually a form of liberation. This was a form of challenging power. This was a form in which common people got some rights for the first time. in their working lives. All right. The perception and remembrance of the 1950s, he says, as a time of repressive conformism and spiritless materialism might relate to the middle-class organization man, the white-collar professional and managerial worker of the time. It did not relate to us, and us being his family, working-class people. All of the discretion that the foreman and the company were losing throughout the process of collective bargaining was flowing right into our home. There were choices, there were prospects, there were possibilities. Few of these had been there before, and now they were. And because they came slowly, year after year, contract by contract, strike by bitter strike, they gave a lilting, liberating feeling to life, a sense that no matter what was wrong today, it could be changed, it could get better. In fact, by the late 1950s, that it was quite likely that it would get better. Hang in there, stick with it. These moral injunctions to daily fortitude made so much more sense than when there were so many visible payoffs for doing so. And as my father would find out, my mother, my sister, and I, like nearly everybody else in American society, were learning to tolerate less and less repression from anybody or anything, including him. If what we lived through in the 1950s was not liberation, then liberation never happens in real human lives. I think this is a very interesting passage that I would like all you to think about. I think he's saying a couple of different things here. One is that that process of solidarity made people feel like they could work together to change things for the better. And if you have faith that that can happen, that is enormously liberating. And secondly, it challenges the dominant idea of the 1950s as just about conformism. He's arguing that for union members, for members of society who experienced that liberation, it caused them to question authority. And that extended even into the household and even into the community. And so if we think about what happened in the 1960s and 1970s with civil rights and women's rights, he's kind of making an argument that that questioning of authority originated with the union movement. I think it's a very interesting argument, and I want you to keep your eye on that argument as you read his book. For if unions are more than just about wages and hours, if they are about liberation, that really makes the story quite a bit richer. Okay, so please post your thoughts, your comments, your questions, your examples to the discussion boards for either Chapter 1 or Chapter 2. And if you read one chapter, please go on the discussion board and read the postings for the other chapter so that you get a fuller sense of the whole book. Okay? Next up, we'll talk about chapters 3 and 4. Thanks.